Advent often begins with this passage from Isaiah. In days to come, the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills. All the nations shall stream to it. Many people shall come and say, "Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. O house of Jacob, come, let us walk in the light of the Lord." Advent, it is the beginning of Advent, the beginning of the Christian calendar. It is perhaps ironic and appropriate that the readings for today and Jesus' warning about not getting caught up in things so much that we don't pay attention to what's going on, it's perhaps appropriate that these readings follow Black Friday, when malls are full of people caught up in their Christmas shopping, caught up in their agendas, caught up in the consumer culture of which we are all a part. Of course, we know, at least in our heads, that a consumer culture such as ours often distorts reality and distracts us from real living. And that's part of what the readings for today call us to pay attention to. Real living, the reality in which we find ourselves. But they also call us to pay attention to reality in light of what we know of God's hopes and dreams for us. So, it's fascinating. The rest of the world has already started celebrating Christmas. I know, it's the 25th of December. Although for us in the Christian calendar, those of us in the UCC tradition, Christmas starts on the 25th and ends later in January. The week before Halloween, I was at one of the malls in our illustrious city and discovered that most of the stores had reduced their Halloween displays to one little section, and everything else was already set up for Christmas. So I suppose some people were celebrating Christmas as early as the 26th of October. Surely, by now, of course, with the Macy's Thanksgiving Day parade and the appearance first of Santa Claus, everybody is celebrating Christmas, right? And we're all part of that spirit. We've all been invited to Christmas parties. We'll have Christmas dinners. We'll see friends. We'll exchange cards or emails or phone calls. Each one of us will be going somewhere to do some shopping, whether it's the mall or the internet. It's all part of the season. But it is, I think, helpful for us to appreciate what Advent offers in the midst of a consumer-driven culture that has already started celebrating something that we're slowly inching toward as Christians. Advent is a time of waiting and watching. Two things, well, Americans like to watch. We watched football on TV last night, but we don't like to wait. We have fast food. We get upset if we have to stand in line at the supermarket for more than 4 or 5 minutes. It's just amazing how fast we expect life to be. And we've got to have the latest smartphone, which will, of course, open up the internet and get us to the Cathedral of Hope webpage in under half a second. We don't like to wait. Let's admit it. But, in fact, waiting is part of our lives. My students at OCCC say that waiting is nothing but boredom. Maybe that's the new name for Advent, or life. Because Advent is a lot like life. We're waiting for things. But let's be careful how we use the words wait and watch. It is a time of preparation for Christmas, but it's not quite Christmas. We have some Christmas hymns and carols, but Advent also has its own hymn kind of interweave the two of them together as we move toward the 25th of December. It is a time of waiting and watching that doesn't simply look forward to something, but it's a time when we allow ourselves to be informed by the past, to look back at what the prophets were saying in Isaiah and Jeremiah and so many other books, to think about the message that the prophets spoke throughout the centuries and how that informs the way we understand what happens on the 25th of December. It is important for us to understand that Advent is a season when we look back in order to look forward, and we look back and appreciate the past and learn from the past, but never to become trapped in the past. That applies, or should apply, to us as individuals and as a congregation, as a Christian community. Stop and think. What Advent suggests to us is, if Jesus Christ is the realization of the hopes and dreams of God and Israel, we need to remember what those hopes and dreams were all about, so that when we come to the manger on the 25th, we know, we realize those dreams and those hopes. Otherwise, we may be looking for the wrong child, like Herod was. Advent is a time then of waiting and remembering, but it is also a time of acting on our hope. That may seem kind of un-American. Acting on hope, aren't we just supposed to wait there like somebody in a waiting room in the doctor's office or the dentist's office, kind of with fear and trembling? But if you stop and think about it, the way we wait and watch for things does indeed affect the way that we live. We live in a society post 9/11 where the media and the government frequently talk about terrorist alerts, to be on the alert, on the watch for things that are dangerous. And so, yes, we gripe about the TSA in the airports, but all of us in some way or another have changed our thinking or changed our lives because of the threat of terrorism. Or just think about Christmas as a more positive example than terrorism. We don't just wait for Christmas to happen. We make a shopping list. We make a wish list and send it to our friends and loved ones. We go shopping for things. We decorate our homes. We invite people to parties. We prepare to go to other people's celebrations. There are things that we do along the way between now and the 25th of December to actually prepare. Waiting is, in Scripture, something that is active, something that involves us doing something rather than simply sitting like bumps on a log. And that's why I think what's important about Advent, when we think about ourselves as individuals, when we think about ourselves as a congregation, when we think about what it means to be Christian in a world that is often cruel and punitive, Advent helps us to recover the language of our faith by turning again to the prophets and the Gospels and not simply rushing ahead to Christmas, but asking ourselves by looking at Scripture and learning from the whole Christian tradition who this child is that we expect. It gives us a language of faith. Now, language is funny. I remember when I was first ordained a priest and I was on call in a hospital, 2 different hospitals, as an on-call chaplain, as well as working in a parish. Whenever somebody died, various chaplains and various family members and various clergy that I worked with would come up with all kinds of ways to say that somebody died. They wouldn't say, John Smith died. They would say, Mr. Smith passed away. Or, even better, Mr. Smith passed. Well, Landry Jones passed last night. Mr. Smith went to a better place. Disneyland? Beach? I don't know. The Super Bowl? Mr. Smith is no longer with us. Right? He's down the hall somewhere. Or my favorite, Mr. Smith expired. Kind of like he had a date on it, like milk or eggs. But never did anybody really want to say the truth. Mr. Smith died. Language is a word. The language of faith is something that helps us to sort out reality and to be honest about our situation as a church, as neighbors to others around us. And faith gives us a language to think about the world. The prophets that we hear in this season of Advent, the gospel readings as we move closer and closer to Christmas, will remind us of the deep truths that are realized and celebrated by a star over Bethlehem and a homeless couple wandering, looking for a place to give birth to a child. Faith gives us a language with which to think about and engage not only our lives but the world around us. It is an alternative to the language of consuming that is so popular in our culture, or the language of power. The language of faith is the kind of thing that moves us from elitism to tender mercies. It creates not a language of exclusion and damnation, as some would have it, but a language of inclusion, a mountaintop feast, as Isaiah speaks of it, where all are welcome. What's fascinating in Isaiah is, remember I said this a couple weeks ago about one of the prophets, some of the prophets talk about a feast in which Israel returns to Zion, but the later prophets all talk about a feast in which the whole world is invited. No one is excluded. That inability to exclude should mark us. That's part of our language. The language of faith moves us from me and my group and my well-being to the well-being of all, especially those that even we find ways to exclude. The language of faith allows us to look at those in need and those who are suffering, not as poor fellows or welfare recipients or fellow citizens, but as neighbors, even as brothers and sisters. That's what happens when we let the language of faith step in and take over from the language of a culture that is destructive and cruel and consuming of human lives. The language of Advent. Think about the readings we heard. They widen the circle of grace. They talk of justice as well as compassion. They speak to us of hope. And they contain a promise of a new community. Those aren't just pipe dreams. Those are really our marching orders, if you will, as Christian people, as we move toward Christmas, to re-examine our lives as individuals in church and to ask ourselves, how are we widening the circle of grace? How are we welcoming others and inviting others and reaching out to those around us to let them know the good news don't know how to heal. It is, if you will, at the beginning of a new calendar year for Christians, a wake-up call for each of us to find ways to pay attention to life, to get back in touch with our hopes, and not just our hopes, but God's hopes for us, and to live as if those hopes make a difference. Advent is a season of hope, but hope is more than a season, more than an emotion, more than an attitude. It is a grace given by God. It is a virtue that we cultivate. But hope is also a place, and we are there. So let us remember and wait and watch